Good afternoon and welcome to this panel session on hope, hype and reality in AI and drug discovery. I'm Robert Tansley, I'm a life science partner at the venture fund Cambridge Innovation Capital, and I'm delighted to be chairing this afternoon's panel. I'd like to extend my thanks to One Nucleus for the invitation. As a VC looking to invest in this field, the key feature I look for is to have a team where there's a combination of deep sector knowledge in three areas: understanding of the biology, understanding of the tools around AI and machine learning, and also the appreciation of bioinformatics and the data. And I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by a panel which has deep expertise in these three areas and who will be able to provide insights in this rapidly expanding field. May I start the session by asking them to introduce themselves, starting with Vishal Sahni. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to the panel as well. My name is Vishal Sahni. I'm a director at MSD in London in the UK, and I lead a drug discovery team of biologists tasked with identifying new drugs for age-related and neurological diseases.
Rabia, can I move to you?
Hi, my name is Rabia, and thanks for the invite. I am a geneticist by training. I've worked at companies like BenevolentAI, and most recently, I built the Discovery Sciences division at Sensign Health, which was a machine learning clinical division that used real-world data to look at patient stratification for clinical trials. And now I'm CEO and founder of Ladder Therapeutics.
Thank you. And Stephen?
Yes, thanks all. I'm Steve Crossan. My background is in tech rather than in biotech. I was previously at Google and then at DeepMind, where, amongst other things, I worked on AlphaFold. I spent a couple of years investing in companies in AI and deep tech, and in particular in the intersection of AI and biology. And I now work 100% in that field, including at GSK, where I am Vice President of AI and Machine Learning.
Thank you. And finally, Alix.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alix Lacoste. I'm the VP of Applied Sciences at BenevolentAI. My background is in molecular and cell biology, and I really got into data science and leading now that function at BenevolentAI. And you'll hear more about BenevolentAI in a little bit.
Thank you. May I ask for the first slide, please? So to introduce the session, maybe look at some of the background to the hype. If we look at the graph on the left, this is a demonstration of the academic publications in the area related to artificial intelligence and how it relates to health and medicine. And looking at how an exponential growth over the last 10 years of publications in this area. And moving on to the graph on the right-hand side, and I think it's often the way where academia leads in a new and novel area, then the venture funding follows closely behind. And similarly, there has been a bit of a lag period, but particularly in the last 5 years, we've seen an explosion of investment and interest from venture groups into early stage companies, which have been working in this field. And I think this has been on the back of huge hope that this may have great transformational steps within the drug discovery process and also open up novel areas for drug discovery. Substantial work has been done obviously in academia, but also in early stage companies through the venture fund. And the third big contributor to this whole field has been what's been happening in pharma companies. And I'm delighted that Vishal is now going to be able to provide us an overview of what pharma companies are looking for in AI and what challenges they would like to see the technology overcoming. Vishal, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. Next slide, please. So all my views are my own. And what I would like to highlight is one of the problems that we are facing in the pharmaceutical industry and in society today. There is a key need for novel approaches. And the reason for that is picking Alzheimer's disease as an example. Globally, the numbers of people living with dementia is going to increase almost by 200%. And in addition to that, the cost that's going to increase as well is significant. And when we look at our ways of how we have been trying to solve this problem, on the graph here on the right, we can clearly see that the number of trials we've had and the number of approaches we have taken over almost a period of 20 years, here shown in black as different projects, has not resulted in success. And in the last 20 years, there's only been one approval shown here in green of a drug for a disease as prevalent and as damaging as Alzheimer's disease. And that's one approval was a combination of previously existing drugs. So what I want to highlight here is the fact that we are really desperate and we need a new approach how we can make pharmaceutical R&D more efficient. Specifically on the next slide, I highlight areas that I personally am working on at the moment, and the challenges that I wanted to highlight are specifically there is a real opportunity today because novel targets are emerging from genetics, from various omic technologies, and the key request that we have from data sciences and from our partners in computational biology and across the entire board of collaborators is our need to increase our ability to validate and choose the right target to create disease-modifying therapies. Secondly, one of the problems we've been grappling with is the lack of translation from preclinical studies to human disease. And we need improved clinical biomarkers to reduce costs and improve efficiency of translation of ideas into the clinic. And the final point, equally important, is the need to demonstrate value of new medicines to society and improve health outcomes in an aging society, where again, real-world evidence and integrating data that is collected over the course of the treatment of a person or over the course of how a treatment is administered in a society needs to be captured and analyzed. So the way on the next slide I envisage the drug discovery process to be informed by AI or ML, or I generally call them in silico methodologies, is to maybe in my mind, in my world, starting and putting the problem right in the center, which is finding the right target and the pathway. And rather than following a linear approach, as may have been done in the past to identify new drugs, start a iterative process where the target is at the center of the problem that we're trying to solve. And we're using information from clinical outcomes on the right, from the molecule or the biology and how they interact with each other, to picking the patients, informing a single most important question of finding the right target. Since this is the most important aspect in my mind where I sit within the drug discovery lifecycle, there is a real need for collaboration and a real need for integration of human expertise with data expertise, having the right hardware, having the right software, and having the right ability to prosecute new ideas in a laboratory setting as well. So finally, on the next slide, what I want to conclude with is my view that in silico methodologies are providing a real opportunity to increase R&D efficiency and to deliver scientific clinical insights to solve healthcare problems facing society today. There is a little bit of hype, and I think we'll go into that in the panel discussion, but I see a real opportunity and hope there as well, and results are emerging, which are very encouraging. It's more critical than ever to foster multi-stakeholder collaborations, including public-private academia and across industries as well and across companies. And in my mind, the single most important factor is to obtain appropriate high-quality data sets and computational resources to interrogate them. And all of this is only possible with the right mindset to adopt these novel methodologies to augment human efforts, and that'll ultimately drive clinical success and benefit society. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishal. This was really great introduction for what I'll talk about, how we use technology in practice to make some of these use cases and use of the data and the technology bring to life. So in the next slide, I'll introduce the Benevolent platform. So at BenevolentAI, we really take a holistic approach to drug discovery with AI and technology as the foundation, which is quite different from how obviously pharma that have been around for a long time are set up to do. So we really use and build our technology to enhance the entire pipeline of drug discovery, and we test our own hypotheses in our labs as well. So what we do at its core is we gather knowledge from databases and the literature and derive knowledge from that. And then we advance candidates through target identification, precision medicine, and molecular design. So in the next slide, I wanted to take a step back and introduce how we think about technology as maturity in drug discovery. And those views are also basically my own from the work I've done at BenevolentAI and also at IBM Watson Health. And so what is reasonable to expect of technology at this time? On one end, on the left, We have many use cases and companies in drug discovery that are really completely technology-less at this time. On the other extreme, we know that AI is often thought of as a tool that can automate decision. So you can imagine that one day we may have parts of the drug discovery process that are fully automated. Now, of course, if you advance on the slides, you see that there's a whole spectrum of uses of technology in between. And if you move forward again, another time actually, really at Benevolent, we think that for most of our current use cases, we're really at this stage where our maturity is at the middle. So that means that typically we take one of the following approaches. Either it's technology augmented, and that really means that the drug discovery scientist is in the driving seat, using the tech to identify insights and explore leads. On the other side, you have the technology generated, actually, if you can just go back one, thank you, where the technology is in the driving seat, guiding the drug discovery to identify targets, drugs, and proposed leads. So it's that balance, right, between is the drug discovery scientist really finding the insights using the tech, or is the technology proposing those and the drug discoverer is reviewing those? And we use both. So in the next slide, I'll go into what it means to take a technology augmented drug discovery approach. And some of the advantages of that is that it really leverages human expertise, which is much more sophisticated than what machines know at this point. It also can enhance our understanding about disease mechanisms, et cetera, by looking at all the data together in an intelligent way. And taking this approach avoids some really naive mistakes that machines make at this point. The disadvantages, though, is that it's more difficult to reproduce because there is heavy human input. And it's, of course, also much more difficult to scale. And it's, for us, working in the ML side, is much more difficult to evaluate model performance because there's so much human intervention in it. Of course, there's also more potential for human bias. In the next slide, I talk about some of these applications for augmented drug discovery approach. So typically target selection, where maybe the tech has proposed some targets, some things that the drug discoverer may not have thought of before, but to really select the ones that really will be progressible, there's a lot of manual expertise that comes into play. Biomarker discovery is another one, and drug design as well, where medicinal chemists have a wealth of information that is not necessarily yet able to be modeled. So what does it look like for the tech that we develop internally for these types of augmented application? It means that we want to develop models that are more interpretable. We understand what the model is doing better. We also develop tools that are exploratory, that are used by the drug discovery scientists, that enable these serendipitous discoveries. And also that it's more agile and nimble tech development, where we may develop modules that can restitch together depending on the use case. So on the next slide, the technology generated drug discovery has some advantages in that. On the other end, it's more reproducible, it's more scalable because the machine really presents through a specific workflow hypotheses, and it's potentially more broadly applicable. So you can imagine you make tools and models that can be disease and drug modality agnostic, which is what we do. But there are some disadvantages, which is to limit human expertise and creativity potentially. Often the models are just not nuanced enough for the types of questions that biologists want and chemists want to ask. And we find a lot of naive mistakes that machines do. So in the next slide, the applications of this is, the tools are quite sophisticated now for extracting connections from the scientific literature. For novel target identification, we have really great models that can actually propose things that just biologists could not come up on their own through the ability of machines to really make long-range connections. Some patient stratification, I think, applications as well. And virtual screening is where it can be a lot more automated in the earlier process of finding candidate drugs. And for tech, again, that means it's kind of nice for us in a way. It's more reproducible. We can really understand and improve better. It's more, we can produce models that are more generalized. And often that does require, though, more stable and larger development teams, and sometimes slower cycles. So those are some of the disadvantages also of taking that approach. So in the next slide, really the gist of this is that an automated approach, is just not yet possible for most areas. We just don't understand biology and chemistry well enough yet. And so we have to be smart. We have to actually augment and give the tools to drug discovery scientists to make the best decisions through an augmented approach. But that's said, we can't stop there because that is still not scalable, and there's so much unmet need in our area that we need to be able to scale this. So finally, in the next slide, I wanted to present some of our successes at BenevolentAI. So in all these 4 areas, in knowledge and target identification and precision medicine and chemistry, we have some really nice success and recent publication. But in particular, earlier this year, because of the COVID crisis, we decided to take an augmented discovery approach to this problem. And we use an interdisciplinary team and a creative use of our tools to find existing drugs to repurpose for COVID. And we found that baricitinib, which is a Lilly drug, was a great candidate. And that hypothesis was actually validated in clinical trials. And in late November, the FDA granted emergency use authorization of baricitinib in hospitalized patients. So that was really a nice demonstration of how we can reuse certain modules that weren't really made for drug repurposing to actually augment our own scientists to really use those in creative way and solve really important problems.
Alix, Vishal, thanks very much. Some really interesting points coming out of there, and it'll be great to come back to discuss some of those. Vishal, I love that idea of the target being at the center and the need for the right software, right hardware, but the key aspect of having the people there who are able to test the hypotheses, and we perhaps could explore that in a bit later. And Alix, that leverage of human expertise and using it as a tool, and the specific examples are great. And it'll be great to hear a little bit more about baricitinib perhaps later on and their work there, because that was obviously a very exciting utilization of the tools. But maybe first I could just move to Steve, and I suppose it's slightly different from your background, you're having a deep tech background. And I just wondered what your hopes for the use of AI machine learning and how they underpinned your desire to move into the drug discovery space. And also, I don't know whether you're able to, how much you perhaps could, I think many people here were very excited by the news around AlphaFold, and whether there's anything you may be able to provide some color to the work that led to that really, really fascinating kind of development there.
Sure. So I think that, to answer the first question, the move for me in this direction is very much practical. It's because while you're at the tech companies, the Googles and the Facebooks and DeepMinds, etc., all of whom are investing in AI technology, and many of them with a view to looking at healthcare scenarios. That's great. They've got an access to a lot of data, a lot of resources, a lot of compute power, a lot of good talent as well. But it's hard in that context to actually close the loop and get towards real world product delivery, really sort of having that impact. That sort of took me for a while into the world of investing in early stage startups in this space. And that's, I'm continuing to do some of that, and that is one way of getting that done. But at the beginning of this year, I was actually trying to collaborate with somebody at GSK on a project. It was a scientific project that I wanted to pursue, and I was kind of talking to them about collaborating. And then got into that conversation where I realized that actually they'd made a significant investment in the engineering around AI, and that was very important to me, something I'll come back to, because I think, and I think a couple of the previous speakers have touched on this, done well, this is an engineering and product job. It's not a data science job, certainly not on its own. And that's a very crucial distinction. So they had already made a significant investment in that talent. The data sets available internally were extremely significant and ones that were not accessible outside. But perhaps the most important thing, and again, to go back to the previous speaker's point, is the access to the experimental capability and the scientists directly to test hypotheses that are being come up with by the AI, and to create an active learning feedback loop cycle. And that's the thing that I'm convinced will be what eventually unlocks this space, is actually the scale at which you can, with medium and high throughput experimental systems, test and validate hypotheses that you're able to come up with from the AI, but crucially close that loop so that you have a continuous active learning scenario. And that's the framework that made me think this would be an interesting place to come to. You're on mute, Robert.
Big one. And anything you can say about AlphaFold and I guess this is kind of a key moment, but it is a stepping stone, but it's a fascinating key moment.
Yeah, no, well, I can tell you something perhaps about the history of that project. And again, this probably speaks a little bit to engineering culture and how important I think bringing engineering culture into pharma is in this context. AlphaFold actually started in a hackathon. In 2016, we ran our first hackathon in the applied group within DeepMind, a 2-day hackathon in which we gave people free rein to go and actually attack any project that they would be interested in that might be relevant. And 2 people, one of whom is also now with me at GSK, went and looked at the problem of protein folding, and is there anything plausible that we could do with some techniques that were coming out of DeepMind within the protein folding? And within a short amount of time, we convinced ourselves that there were non-random results and there was something interesting there. And so that then, as often happens with hackathons, that then caused us to spin up a small team to go start looking at it. We brought in some external biological expertise as well in the form of David Jones from UCL, who essentially came in and taught us systems biology. He taught us about 3 years worth of systems biology in 3 months. And that then sort of took us off to the races. It was a great space for us to work in because there was a validated standard set that you could, there's CASP, which is the protein folding Olympics, which gets run every 2 years. And so we could both benchmark where we were against all the previous history of CASP, and that also gave us a target to aim at, which initially was CASP 2018, which DeepMind won with the first version of AlphaFold. But this second version, which has just been released this week, which I did not work on and claim no credit for, has taken the state of the art much, much further. It's the state of the art, I agree with you. Anybody who's looked at this closely will say, it's the state of the art in predicting the fold of globular proteins in X-ray crystallographic structures, the kinds of things that appear in CASP. And so you can make all of these exceptions and say, oh, well, it's not membrane-bound proteins and we can't do single-point mutations very well. And there's lots of caveats around, has the protein folding problem really been solved? And the answer is no. But what's exciting about it for me is this is the starting gun on we clearly are going to solve those problems in the next few years, and that is going to mean that a lot more people come into the field, a lot more grant money is going to come into the field, a lot more investment dollars are going to come into the field. People are going to start to choose this area as a place to do PhDs and to go into this research. And for that for me is the most exciting thing about this. It's like the starting gun on what I see as a decade of great investment in this area and great advances in this area.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And just say with a slight confidence that you're involved in one of our other companies, Riverlane, where it's quantum computing, and this quantum supremacy we recently announced, demonstrated that this is feasible, this is possible, and opens the doors to many great things. Thank you very much, Steve. Rabia, maybe I could turn to you just for a moment, just because your background is very interesting, given a deep understanding of biology and also data science, which is quite a rare combination. But I just wonder whether you could share some of your thoughts about what is required in order for us to fulfill the potential of AI in drug discovery. What are the tools we need?
Yeah, so it's really interesting, Stephen. You mentioned on it briefly, which is GSK has the data, and worked with Alix at Benevolent as well, and a lot of the successes that we've seen in the field, classified as success, either a venture exit or drug to market, there's a very unique underlying theme that exists in all of them. So Flatiron, Recursion is doing very well, and they have all generated a plethora of data that they own and manage. And we spend a lot of time talking about the models, the new AlphaFold that's come out. But in fact, I would argue that we don't yet have data sets that are generated on the appropriate disease models to actually make a difference to patients. So we have a lot of data sets generated on cancer cell lines, and we know those cancer cell lines do not translate, which is what Vishal touched upon earlier. So we can put all of the fancy AI we want left, right, and center at those data sets. They won't actually increase what we care about, which is phase 2 and phase 3 success. We don't have data sets that are tracking patients longitudinally for complex disorders like Alzheimer's. So we don't actually understand the biology. We don't understand the diseases, and we just don't have the data right now. So there is going to be an immense incremental advancement in AI, but until we can start generating the appropriate data sets, the appropriate disease models to test our hypotheses that have phase 2 and phase 3 translatability and longitudinal patient monitoring, I think that will be the next roadblock that, although AI seems to have improved, I think our ability to generate data at scale has not yet hit a point where we're going to be able to keep up with what AI is doing. Stephen, sorry to...
I was just going to come in and reinforce that point. I think that's absolutely right. People often talk about AI as something that you can sort of bring in and sprinkle over a drug discovery pipeline, and suddenly you'll get this massive effect. That's not really the case at all. AI or data-driven learning systems are only one component of what you need. You absolutely need to think about what is the right kind of data that you need to generate. And as with all of applied AI, most of it is the applied bit. It's not the AI bit. It's mostly the data engineering, the data management, the thinking about how you generate that data. It's the design of the experimental systems that actually dominates your success more than do you have a particularly clever technique to do. The two things are coupled though, because as you generate more data, you can then generate better models, and some of the models can generate data themselves as well. So there is a coupling there. But what most pharma companies, I think, or most drug discovery companies are not taking into account is actually most of the work is on the data side and on the engineering side and on the experimental side. That's where we need to focus.
And if I can just add one more point, as a biologist, we spend a lot of time thinking about designing experiments to answer a biological question. But this active loop that Stephen mentioned, and maybe Alix can comment on this as well, now we need to have two different types of data generation exercises. One is asking the right question on biology, and then the other one is generating data to actually negate hypotheses that AI algorithms, so in silico hypothesis generation. So is this a good biological hypothesis? And then there's just data generation to feed in silico pipelines, and they may be the same and they may actually be different. And that's a shift in the way we've thought about biology. Traditionally, it's not what a biologist normally thinks about. And so these interdisciplinary teams that Alix spoke about, I think, are going to be really pivotal in the next 10 years.
Yeah, thanks. So I totally agree with all of this. I would say that perhaps there is a danger to move into too much data is king and queen, because really there is so much caveat still with experimental data that the biologists and the chemists will be the first one to tell you about. And so I think taking a pure, we're going to engineer the system and feedback the data and it's not yet possible because the data doesn't exist. So in the midst of that, and we have, you know, really successful company that I think will do well, like Recursion and In Citro, who really take that approach. At Benevolent, we say, well, we still think there's so much data out there that's public and that can complement, and the sources of errors that we have from public data and literature data are really complementary to the errors that you find through experimental data. So I think that's why I think bringing the scientists and that expertise in the system is so critical, because there is so much biases and caveats still with experimental data.
I wonder if you guys think there may be almost two phases of how we employ data science. The first one being harnessing the rich public data that you describe, Alix, and finding associations, patterns, and generating maybe slightly more biased hypotheses to validate in the lab and disprove in the lab. And the second area in the future might be when we have those really well curated data sets to actually start making predictions and longitudinal hypotheses that are unbiased. And I'm wondering whether we are currently at the stage where we're still grappling with all the rich data sets that exist internally in companies like MSD, GSK, and other big pharma companies, as well as the public domain where all of the data seems to come together. It'll be great to hear your reflections as experts on the data science side, how you think about it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's a really good way to put it, that I think at this point, we can't ignore the public data and the data, the expertise against that exists in our scientists, because while we're even, you know, for us as a company acquiring data, it always sounds better than it really is in reality, where, you know, it can take a very long time, or generating it ourselves as well. And then the quality is often, you know, it's not as good as we'd think, right? Or we'd hope. So it's going to take, I think, a long time to get to the point where we can really make data-generated decision or data-driven decision in this space. But I think we can get there. That is the dream for sure.
Vishal, I think that comment was really interesting, because what I'm beginning to see is everyone wants to build a giant data lake. Everyone's like, oh, all of this data exists. If we build a giant data lake and put AI on top of it, we will all of a sudden have like 80% probability phase 2. And from everything I've seen, there is no evidence to suggest that that is currently possible. I think what Alix is saying is that data is noisy. We need humans to actually make very critical decisions right now. And so you can build the best data lakes. It's noisy. And at the end of the day, this augmented approach that Alix, you presented, I think is going to be there for a very long time, until we can go to complete in silico. At least that's what my experience has shown.
And yeah, to that point, and actually as another side effect from this way of thinking about active learning and data generation to validate hypotheses, to validate models, rather than data generation to validate biology. The most important thing we can do is to think about and take seriously how we generate data going forwards, not worrying so much about the historical data. If I take a lesson from Google, especially, one of the sort of hidden gems of the Google infrastructure is its logging infrastructure, which is one of the very first things that was ever built at Google. It was just the infrastructure which allowed Google to log all of the data that flowed in from all of its systems, and which was built, which a huge amount of engineering went into it. About 1/3 of Google's overall engineering effort is in its data infrastructure and its management systems, and that the logging piece fits within that. What that meant was that from a very early stage in its existence, it was set up that all data that was created going forwards was created in a more or less consistent way, in a way where everybody more or less knew where to find that data if you had access to it, and where across heterogeneous data sets, there was enough commonality that data could be joined together and that insights could be gleaned from that data. And that was all done by being very careful and thoughtful, both about systems and hardware and where you store this data and how you scale that, but also about things, very boring things like metadata structure and catalogs and all of this kind of stuff. And because there was that investment very early on in the history of Google, that was like a compounding return for 20 years in that investment. And that's the mentality that we have to get into, I think, as the pharma industry, is we have to have that same level of care about our data going forwards.
Steve, I think that's a really important point, and one which I wanted to explore a bit more. And given the public health implications of this, is there an argument almost to have a pre-competitive date, either way to manage that data, or whether that should be a responsibility from a non-commercial, whether a government funded, a welcome putting big initiative in order to, because it is one of the main drags on development is not having that. And if MSD or Pfizer or AZ do it in isolation, is there a risk that actually that progress will be slow? And is there an argument for trying to make it more standardized and having it pre-competitive?
Well, there are a lot of initiatives at a governmental and a public level in this very area. They themselves are somewhat fragmented. I mean, there are several even just within the UK. Even just within the NHS, there were several different initiatives, roughly touching on the same thing. But I think that will, over time, lead to the emergence of standards and sort of standard ways of doing things, so that even though people are, doing projects independently, they may be doing them in ways where, the data is more congruent and can be joined together for learning in the future in a more easy way. So I think we already see some of that development of open standards, and I think it will be enriched over time.
I'm going to be a bit contentious, Robert, and say that, where we have seen successful data curation has required immense investment, Flatiron being the use case, Tempus, Hallmusk. These companies are investing tremendous amounts in data curation. And, we've seen the flip side. The NHS data is worth $9 billion. Having worked and extracted data out of the NHS, it requires so much investment in cleaning and curation. I don't think that a pre-competitive consortium will work, because actually, I think the AI algorithms over time will become commoditized, and the differentiation will be in the data that you sit on as opposed to the AI algorithms that you have. And so why would a company want to give up that competitive differentiation if, for example, I'm working in IPF or NASH, and I have a really unique NASH model that has high translatability to phase 2. I wouldn't want to give up the transcriptomics on that into a general data store. So I although conceptually I think pre-competitive is great, when it comes down to getting it done, I just don't know how that would work.
Yeah.
I guess I can add a reflection on that as well. I almost see two parallel approaches again. One is the internal curation of data, which is going to be very infrastructure heavy and requires a lot of time and effort, and exactly as you described, Rabia. But then I do see an opportunity for federated learning models, where maybe there is a way of how you can provide access to certain type of data that is not under any privacy or competitive constraint, and that common data will allow everyone to progress faster, and then you can still retain some competitive advantage. So I'm wondering, as experts, whether federated learning models are an area that we should all think about in more detail, so that we overcome some of the restrictions you mentioned.
I think there are companies doing that. Yeah, absolutely agree with you, Vishal. Absolutely, yeah.
Again, a little bit of a caveat. I think federated learning is also not a panacea for solving this problem. It can solve problems of where you don't have access to the data because of sort of partnership reasons or privacy reasons or those kind of things. So it can be something of a solution to that kind of a problem, but it doesn't take away the need to have consistent curation of that data across all of the different data sets. In fact, often a federated learning will take sort of one data curation problem and turn it into 10 data curation problems.
Okay, that's good to know, actually. Yeah. I guess, yeah, as you say, yeah, the internal curation will always be critical to make any data accessible. Yeah, yeah, thanks. Yeah.
So Rabia, can I just kind of push on that? And I think it's a very interesting thought that actually some of the tools will become commoditized or standard. So do you think the biggest advantage moving forward will be in biologically focused companies with an understanding of AI, or will it be in actually data companies with an understanding of biology? where do you see the biggest kind of wins to be?
You know, this is such an interesting question. And now biotechs, especially, you know, companies that are starting out, Alex, I'm sure you have lots of thoughts on this, which is like, are you a biotech company or are you a tech company? And then you get asked, are you a data company or are you a biotech company? And to me, I just have stopped viewing the world that way and started thinking about what do we need to do to make a difference to the patient and how do we start from there? And if you view the world from patient first, as opposed to data first or AI first or anything else first, then you start realizing that, okay, well, patient data becomes really valuable, patient-reported outcome measures become really valuable, highly relevant disease models become really valuable, and all of those are data generation points. And then you apply AI or statistics or causal inference or anything you'd like on top of those data sets. So personally, I believe what pharma already has a competitive advantage in, which is large compound libraries and large data sets, is something they can really build upon. And companies that are succeeding, benevolent, in vitro, recursion, are also building large data sets. And so irrespective of what I think just benchmarking on what we're seeing, success is driven by data accumulation. And the AI is almost becoming one of those things you apply. But that's my personal opinion, and love to hear what other people think.
Alex, I want kind of bring you in and see what your thoughts around that is.
Sure. No, I agree with this. I do think it's nuanced again because there's a lot of promise in generating and acquiring a lot of data. But as Vishal was saying, you know, and you as well, Rabia, it's also in the curation and the understanding. And so what we focused a lot at BenevolentAI is in the integration of all this data. And again, going back to how different data sources have different sets of errors, being able to actually integrate those and have decorrelated sources of errors, we think is really powerful. So yes, we don't have the data that, you know, pharma has, but they still want to collaborate with us because we have this way of, you know, integrating what they have into a common knowledge ontology, a way to relate diseases with their mechanisms, with their, you know, the tissue. So that deep nuance of the data and putting that in context is so important that I do think we have really an advantage there, even though we don't have the data that pharma may have, or we right now are not invested heavily like others are in data generation. I think there's a huge power in integrating what's already known actually and making those wide range connections.
Maybe I could just shift the discussion slightly on this topic. When I first joined industry 25 years ago, the internal R&D was critical, and many companies, large pharma, did very little external resourcing. What we're seeing here with AI is the development of a lot of capability in-house, but also probably 20 or 30 relatively big deals between early stage companies and the companies such as BenevolentAI and others around that. And I just wonder what the panel's thoughts about where innovation will be, how that synergy between early stage companies and large farmers would work, and where you feel that, you know, the big step forwards will be, and how to kind of optimize those relationships. I don't know, Vishal, maybe I can represent your perspective on given that MSD is making a big investment in this field and where they feel that they can gain the biggest advantage.
Sure, thanks, Robert. So I completely agree with the sentiment that I think everyone expressed, that partnerships are going to be extremely important. I think the way I see it is data will become a commodity in the future as the curation and the access to the data becomes better. And at that point, it doesn't really matter anymore who will develop the next drug. I think it'll become a question of where the right leaders sit within the company. So it becomes a mindset where I think the view that we are taking is that we can only be successful in collaboration. So I think targets and analytics and ideas may be coming out of collaborative consortia, and maybe a pharma company that comes up with the idea, it may be a biotech, it may be an AI company, it may be a tech company. Whoever comes up with the best idea, teams will come together, and where a pharma company is very, very successful and strong is to develop an idea all the way to the market. So in short, if I answer your question, the collaboration is going to be key. The new ideas may come from the really innovative quick agile teams that are out there working on problem solving that maybe we are not currently thinking about in as much detail as they are, or not able to answer as well as they are with the tech that is available. But eventually pharma and other companies, be it data companies, tech companies, biotech companies, will come together to develop projects and products in consortium or in collaboration.
Thank you. Rabia, I might ask you, obviously you've got, just from your career choice, you've got a thought about where the biggest wins might be. I don't know, what are your thoughts about how smaller companies can work with large companies which maybe have the data sets, have that capabilities, have that ability to close the feedback loop through their biology. How do you feel that the small companies can interact in this ecosystem?
So I think that's a really interesting question, because we don't really, when you're on the other side from big pharma, there's this question on like, how do you get a pharma deal? And that like preoccupies most startups significantly. And from my experience, actually, and Alix can obviously comment on this as well, but from my experience, it's about what can you bring to the table that they may find valuable. And it can be something as simple as a way of working. I know, Stephen, you mentioned that, bringing engineering culture into pharma is a very interesting thing. Alternatively, data sets or a different way of thinking, a new modality, so PROTACs being an example. And so I think pharma is now beginning to look at smaller companies and say, oh, how are we going to work with these new modalities, these new ideas, and where do we place our bets early on? Because they're very good at IND to phase 3. Excellent. But everything before that, there's innovation happening in every step of the process. And as long as you're delivering value, and I think if you can actually link the delivery of value to impact to patients somehow, either that's like patient stratification, which Alix pointed to, or drug targets that are genetically linked. I think that is going to be the driving force, because everyone is looking to make a difference at phase 2 at this point. And any small company that can say confidently, our approach is either a new modality or is going to make a difference in phase 2 has a competitive advantage, either via culture, either via data, or via algorithm.
Alix, I know BenevolentAI have I believe a hybrid model of collaboration, but also developing their own pipeline. I don't know where you see the biggest kind of advances being through that model.
Yeah, I think what Rabia said definitely resonates. So for us, one of our really successful partnership has been with AstraZeneca around 2 diseases, and coming up with really innovative way to think about new targets that are really disease modifying, because that's definitely a crisis, right, in the industry, where we may find treatments that really placate the symptoms but are not really truly curative. So again, through our approach, we've applied our target identification method and savoir-faire and tools and data, actually, right, to their problem. And they found some targets that they wouldn't have thought of, and other targets that they actually had in their portfolio. So I think for them, it brings that innovation that Rabia was talking about, that we can do that. Kind of in a smaller company, we're much more likely to have hackathons and I think successful innovative sprints. And then for us, it's really great because it allows us to test out our hypothesis and our way of working and our tools in the hands of people who have done this for a very long time, right? And to really push their value. And push our engineering as well. Stephen, definitely we had to invest quite a bit, right, to make these tools accessible to a new environment for a pharma company. So it's pushed also our tools to be much better, much more robust. And again, really the learning through this process, yeah.
Another point is, I meant to start off this as an introduction, just the explosion of academic work in the whole field of AI with medicine. And I just wonder whether the panel's got any thought how we can better facilitate the collaboration between academia and drug discovery groups. And I know particularly pertinent, we're based here in Cambridge, there's a lot of academic research around AI and a particular interest in medicine, and recently announced the launch of the Cambridge Centre for AI in Medicine, which is a collaboration with pharma companies as well. And and it seems a great way of bridging that gap between cutting edge academic work and this application. I don't know, Steve, how your thoughts are about how that we can leverage the expertise out of academia in this whole space.
Absolutely, and GSK is a partner in that Cambridge Centre, as with many other centres around the UK and around the world. I think pharma has long collaborated with academia and has kind of mature and developed models for doing so. Everything from PhD sponsorships to big MRAs and joint ventures and so on. So I think the collaboration muscle is there, and we're increasingly seeing more of those collaborations be around data and AI and innovative algorithmic approaches. One of the challenges that we have to overcome in doing that is basically the sort of systems compatibility challenge. In that academia is often extremely good at the science side and the algorithmic side as well, but we have a very big, I keep saying, big investment on the engineering side and in a platform that enables us to do our work. Exposing that outside of our organization so that external collaborators can work with us on that is a challenge that we need to overcome. I think open source is going to be a big part of that, because at the end of the day, we probably care more about the results than we do about the IP that's embodied in a lot of the tooling. Maybe there's some sort of secret source algorithms that we want to keep inside, but a lot of the tooling and tool chain of doing that is something that we can share outside. So I think that's going to be a big part of the future as well, is getting these collaborations around tooling platforms.
Vishal, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think Steve covered it really, really well. I think we are also very keen and part of many collaborations where we also realize the value of the academic insight, the ideas, the data science expertise, and augmenting and leveraging our own internal strengths with those capabilities. And as I mentioned before, I think that's really the key to success going forward.
I'm conscious of time. We're drawn to the close. So maybe in the last few minutes, I can kind of blatantly abuse my position as chairperson by asking people around the table a question. So if we're looking to invest and make investments in companies which are working with AI in drug discovery, I would just seek your advice about what we should be looking for. What are the areas which would be the best use of our investment? And perhaps guide me about where you feel the really big innovations and developments and progress will be made, particularly from a perspective of an early stage company. And maybe Alix, I could start with you on what advice would you give me about what's the next big thing and where I should be looking at?
Thank you for that question. That's not an easy one, but I'll do my best. Yeah, I think the need is really what the companies has to articulate really clearly. What is that new technology that they're bringing or new data set to meet that need? I think to Rabia's point around what the pharma are looking for is sometimes different from what new companies kind of sell themselves as to be. So I think a company that says, we're just going to solve this broad problem using data and AI and is not very specific around it, has less, is less likely to really make a difference.
Steve, what would your advice to me be?
So I think the most important thing in this space, and it's a very general thing for early stage companies, but it applies just as much to this space as any others, is to look for a very clear and demonstrated product and engineering culture within any early stage business. I think that culture is the thing, is the fundamental thing that you want to care about. And what I mean by that is, is this a business that takes engineering and scalability seriously, but perhaps even more importantly, is it a business that takes product seriously? Does it realize that it's in the business of creating something to create value for users, and it understands the whole sort of end-to-end series of questions that they have to understand and care about in order to do that, not just once, but to create a machine which is a process which can do that again and again and again. And I think companies which have that aspect, as with all fields, as Y Combinator says, make something people want. That's the fundamental thing at the end of the day. I think the other interesting thing on early stage companies I'm really interested in Rabia and Alix, your view on this is, in this space, particularly AI and biology, there's the question, are you a software company? Are you selling software as a service to external customers, to pharma? Or are you an asset developing company? Are you aspiring to eventually to be your own biotech and eventually your own pharma company as well? And that question, I think, is a very interesting question to look at. If you look at where the investment dollars have flowed, they've tended to flow towards the companies that have set themselves up as the asset generating companies and have on the basis of being able to use this technology to generate more assets than could be done otherwise. In other words, more like a traditional biotech investment than tech investment. But I'm interested, I think that thinking is evolving in the market. So I'm really, especially Rabia, I'm very interested in your view on that.
Well, maybe go to Rabia next. And certainly you probably have the clearest view, given your current company. And
yeah, as someone that is currently grappling with, are we an AI company or are we a biotech? And I'm still holding on to my guns, which is like, why we're both. I don't understand. No one ever said, do you do stats or do you do biology? So why do I have to decide between AI and biology? But the answer to your question, Robert, I think, what is the problem we're trying to solve, which is what Alix said, right? And having a clear path as to how the product that you're building is going to solve that problem. I think that the most interesting problem in pharma right now is, how do you pick any indication and have a very clear path to phase 2 and impact to patients? I have not seen a tractable hockey stick growth model for SaaS companies in pharma. So I don't know what that model looks like, because there's not enough large players. It's not like a Google. And so either we've seen exits on data, Flatiron, Tempus, or we've seen biotech asset exits. So personally, I don't think there is a hockey stick growth venture return ecosystem that can exist on a SaaS. We're going to build this tool and we're going to sell it to pharma over and over again. So really, you're going to end up, Robert, investing in companies that can accelerate your ability to hit a phase 2 positive. So either higher probability of phase 2 because of our technology, or more shots on goal because of our technology. And those are the two things that I think most companies now in this space are saying AI is going to allow us to do one of those two things better, faster, quicker, cheaper. Pick, modality. So either we'll do RNA, either we'll do small molecule, either we'll do antibodies, but really it has to be one of those. How do you get to patient impact faster?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think you have to be a very brave person to try and break that model and go for something which has got no precedence around that. Maybe Vishal, the final word is with you. And so how would you advise, and where do you feel we're looking to the future, where I should be focusing my attention as an investor?
Not an easy question to end with, but thanks, Robert. So I think the way I look at it, and I think about that question a lot as well, is I look at it in 3 domains. One being, what's the data, what's the analytics, and who's the leadership team? And taking aside the leadership team, which we all agree on, I guess. On the data and analytics side, for the problems that I'm working with, there are probably 4 data sets: omics data sets, chemistry, structure activity type relationship data sets, imaging data sets, and any kind of text mining, natural language processing data sets. If within those 4 categories, a company is excellent or provides a significant value addition to what we do internally, then I would really like to reach out to them and speak with them and understand how we can work together. If I analogously, I would also invest in those companies. And then I guess the question could be taken even further. If you then want to look at the value chain across drug discovery, there are companies that, as Rabia mentioned, are going to work on clinical predictions. There are going to be companies that are going to be involved in digital therapeutics and predicting novel types of drugs. All those areas, we could spend an hour discussing the different companies at different stages of investment. That could be interesting. But within the target ID space where I am, those 4 or 5 criteria are the ones that I'm really excited by at the moment.
Yeah, thank you very much. And you're right, there's so many other aspects which we haven't even touched on yet, and a fascinating area. But unfortunately, we're out of time now, so it just leaves me to say a really big thank you for sharing your thoughts and your expertise. And thank you very much indeed.